What happens when a legal agreement signed behind closed doors shakes an entire nation's confidence in the justice system? Tonight, we take you inside one of the most controversial legal arrangements in modern American history, a deal that would later ignite outrage, fuel investigations, and permanently alter public trust in prosecutorial discretion. The story of Jeffrey Epstein and the 2008 plea agreement is not simply about one individual or one courtroom decision. It is about the mechanics of power, the interpretation of the law, and an enduring question of whether justice is applied equally to all. In this detailed analysis, we carefully examine how the agreement was structured, what legal provisions were included, and why the consequences of that deal continue to echo across the national conversation. At the center of the controversy stands Jeffrey Epstein, a financier whose connections to influential figures and whose criminal allegations would eventually become headline news worldwide. But in 2008, the public did not yet fully grasp the scope of what had been negotiated or the impact it would have on victims, prosecutors, and the broader justice system. The agreement, formerly known as a non-prosecution agreement, was arranged by federal prosecutors in Florida and allowed Epstein to plead guilty to state charges instead of facing potentially more severe federal prosecution. On the surface, plea agreements are a common and legitimate tool within the American legal system, designed to conserve resources and deliver swift resolutions. However, this particular agreement contained clauses that extended beyond typical practice, and it was these provisions that later sparked intense scrutiny. Official court documents reveal that the agreement granted immunity not only to Epstein, but also to potential co-conspirators, a broad protection that critics argue was unusually expansive. Legal analysts would later examine the precise language of the agreement, noting how specific phrases shielded unnamed individuals from federal charges connected to the investigation. This raised fundamental questions about transparency and fairness, especially when considering the seriousness of the allegations involved. The structure of the deal allowed Epstein to serve a sentence that many observers later described as lenient, including work release privileges that permitted him to leave jail during the day. As the details gradually became public knowledge, journalists and legal experts began dissecting how such an arrangement had come into existence. They examined the decision-making process inside the U.S. Attorney's Office at the time and explored whether prosecutorial discretion had been exercised appropriately. Prosecutorial discretion grants authorities the power to determine which charges to pursue and how to allocate resources, but also demands accountability. The Epstein agreement became a focal point for a larger national debate about whether influence, status, or legal strategy had shaped the outcome. Critics argued that the victims were not adequately informed about the federal agreement, a claim that would later form the basis of legal challenges. Supporters of the prosecutor's decision contended that the deal reflected the realities of evidentiary challenges and strategic considerations. Yet as the years passed, public reaction intensified, driven by the perception that the agreement represented unequal treatment under the law. Media investigations revisited the case, analyzing court transcripts, correspondence, and internal memoranda. Each document added another layer to an already complex narrative. The controversy grew not only because of the legal outcome, but because of what it symbolized. In a justice system built on the principle that all individuals stand equal before the law, any appearance of preferential treatment can erode public confidence. The 2008 plea agreement became more than a legal document. It became a symbol of perceived imbalance. As renewed attention focused on the agreement years later, federal authorities reopened scrutiny into the circumstances surrounding it. Congressional inquiries, public statements from legal scholars, and investigative reporting kept the issue in the national spotlight. The case prompted discussions about reforming notification requirements for victims, strengthening oversight of non-prosecution agreements, and clarifying the boundaries of prosecutorial authority. For many Americans, the name Jeffrey Epstein became inseparable from questions about accountability and institutional responsibility. This first phase of our examination lays the groundwork for understanding how a single agreement, negotiated within the framework of existing law, could trigger such far-reaching consequences. It is a story rooted in legal procedure, yet amplified by public perception and moral outrage. As we continue our in-depth analysis, we will look more closely at the legal language that shaped the deal, the immunity clauses that extended its reach, and the broader implications for a justice system constantly balancing efficiency with fairness. As the legal language of the 2008 agreement came under sharper examination, what once appeared to be a routine exercise of prosecutorial discretion began to reveal layers of complexity that few outside legal circles had previously considered. Analysts pored over the non-prosecution agreement line by line, studying its phrasing with meticulous attention, because in legal documents, every word carries weight. The immunity clause, in particular, stood at the center of growing concern. It did not merely resolve charges against Jeffrey Epstein at the federal level. It extended protection to potential co-conspirators who were not publicly named within the document. This sweeping language raised profound concerns about accountability and transparency, especially as new allegations and investigative findings emerged years later. Legal scholars debated whether the breadth of immunity was customary or extraordinary, and whether federal prosecutors had exceeded traditional boundaries in crafting the deal. The agreement also contained confidentiality provisions that critics argued limited public awareness at a critical stage of the process. Victims later claimed that they were not properly notified before the federal case was effectively closed, an issue that would trigger litigation centered on the Crime Victims' Rights Act. That statute was designed to ensure that victims are informed and consulted in federal criminal proceedings, and its alleged violation intensified scrutiny of the prosecutor's conduct. Court filings in subsequent years revealed internal communications that added further complexity to the timeline, showing how negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. While plea agreements are often negotiated discreetly, the scale and sensitivity of this case magnified every procedural decision. The debate shifted from whether a plea agreement was permissible to whether the process upheld the spirit of justice that the law intends to protect. Public attention surged again when investigative journalism brought renewed focus to the case, presenting previously unseen documents and highlighting inconsistencies in public explanations. Reporters examined correspondence between defense attorneys and federal officials, analyzing how the final language of the agreement came to include such expansive protections. The structure of the arrangement allowed Epstein to avoid federal indictment altogether, despite the severity of the underlying allegations. He ultimately pleaded guilty to state charges and served a sentence in county jail, a penalty that critics described as disproportionately light compared to similar federal cases. Work release privileges, which allowed him to leave custody during the day, became a symbol of perceived preferential treatment. As details spread, outrage grew not only among legal experts, but also among members of the public who questioned how such accommodations could have been approved. Lawmakers began calling for reviews of prosecutorial decision-making standards, emphasizing the need for clearer guidelines when negotiating agreements involving serious offenses. The controversy also placed a spotlight on the broader concept of prosecutorial discretion itself. In theory, discretion allows prosecutors to allocate limited resources and prioritize cases effectively, but without transparency and oversight, discretion can be perceived as unchecked power. The Epstein agreement forced a national reckoning with that tension. Was a decision a pragmatic resolution shaped by evidentiary limitations, or did it reflect an imbalance influenced by high-powered legal representation and social connections? The absence of full public visibility during the negotiation stage fueled suspicion. Years after the agreement was signed, federal courts would revisit the question of whether victims' rights had been violated, keeping the issue alive in legal discourse. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice faced increasing pressure to review its internal policies and consider reforms. The debate extended beyond one office in Florida. It became a discussion about systemic safeguards. Legal commentators analyzed whether non-prosecution agreements should require judicial approval in cases of significant public interest, arguing that greater oversight could prevent similar controversies. Others cautioned that imposing rigid constraints might hinder the flexibility necessary for effective law enforcement. In the midst of this legal and political storm, the name Jeffrey Epstein resurfaced repeatedly in headlines, each mention reigniting public frustration. The unfolding narrative began to take on a broader symbolic meaning. It was no longer confined to a single plea agreement, but represented questions about equality before the law, the influence of wealth and status, and the responsibilities of those entrusted with prosecutorial authority. As congressional committees requested documents and officials delivered testimony, suspense built around what additional revelations might surface. The public waited to see whether accountability would follow, or whether the agreement would remain an unchangeable artifact of past decisions. The scrutiny intensified when subsequent federal investigations were announced years later, signaling that earlier conclusions might not represent the final chapter. That development cast the 2008 agreement in an even more dramatic light, prompting observers to wonder whether the legal system was correcting itself or confronting its own limitations. Each new filing, each newly disclosed memorandum, deepened the complexity of the story. The central question lingered: how could a single document drafted in 2008 reshape national debate for more than a decade? The answer lay in the intersection of law, power, and perception, a convergence that ensured the controversy would not fade quietly into history. As the years unfolded and the national conversation intensified, the 2008 plea agreement became more than a legal controversy. It became a defining case study in how institutional decisions can reverberate far beyond the courtroom. The renewed federal charges brought against Jeffrey Epstein in 2019 reignited scrutiny of the earlier deal, forcing both the public and legal professionals to confront unresolved questions. How could a non-prosecution agreement constructed more than a decade earlier still shape the trajectory of justice? The answer lay in the lasting implications of immunity provisions, procedural choices, and the perception that accountability had been unevenly applied. When Epstein was arrested again on federal charges in New York, it signaled that prior resolutions had not extinguished federal authority entirely, yet also underscored the complexity of overlapping jurisdictions and prior agreements. Legal experts debated whether the 2008 arrangement had limited prosecutorial options or whether its scope had been misunderstood. Court proceedings once again placed the earlier agreement under a microscope, with judges examining its language and the intentions behind its drafting. Public attention surged to unprecedented levels, fueled by widespread media coverage and calls for transparency. The story no longer centered solely on one agreement, but expanded into a broader evaluation of systemic safeguards. Lawmakers proposed legislative reforms designed to strengthen victims' rights, clarify notification requirements, and enhance oversight of non-prosecution agreements in cases of significant public interest. Within the Department of Justice, internal reviews were conducted to assess how the original decision had been made and whether policy adjustments were necessary to prevent similar controversies. The findings of those reviews revealed procedural shortcomings and communication failures, reinforcing the importance of transparency in high-profile cases. Yet even as reforms were discussed, the narrative carried an undercurrent of suspense. Observers questioned whether new investigations would expose additional details about the original negotiations or about individuals who may have been shielded by its terms. The immunity clause that once seemed obscure now stood as a focal point of national curiosity. Legal scholars emphasize that non-prosecution agreements are not inherently improper, but they argue that their legitimacy depends on clarity, fairness, and public confidence. The Epstein case illustrated how easily that confidence can erode when secrecy and ambiguity surround prosecutorial decisions. Beyond the courtroom, the controversy influenced public discourse about wealth, influence, and equality before the law. Advocacy groups demanded greater accountability and called for structural reforms to ensure that no individual, regardless of status, could benefit from opaque legal arrangements. The debate transcended partisan lines, uniting voices across the political spectrum in a shared concern about fairness. As congressional hearings examined the actions of federal officials, testimony highlighted the delicate balance between discretion and duty. Prosecutors must weigh evidence, anticipate trial risks, and allocate limited resources, yet they must also uphold the principle that justice must be seen as impartial. The 2008 plea agreement demonstrated how that balance can be questioned when outcomes appear inconsistent with public expectations. The renewed charges and subsequent legal developments added further complexity to an already intricate story. When Epstein died in federal custody later in 2019, the event generated global headlines and intensified speculation about unanswered questions. Investigations into the circumstances of his death, combined with ongoing civil litigation involving victims, kept the case firmly embedded in public consciousness. The narrative evolved from a single plea agreement into a multifaceted examination of institutional accountability, detention protocols, and the pursuit of justice beyond criminal convictions. For many observers, the controversy underscored the importance of vigilance in safeguarding the integrity of the legal system. The lessons drawn from this case extended to broader discussions about prosecutorial transparency, judicial oversight, and the mechanisms available to victims seeking redress. Legal reforms enacted in subsequent years reflected an acknowledgement that procedural clarity is essential to maintaining trust. Yet the enduring significance of the 2008 agreement lies not only in policy changes, but also in the awareness it generated. It compelled citizens to scrutinize how decisions are made within powerful institutions and to demand explanations when outcomes appear inconsistent with the ideals of fairness. The story of Jeffrey Epstein and the 2008 Plea agreement remains a reminder that the rule of law depends not only on statutes and courtrooms, but also on public confidence in the impartial application of justice. As we conclude this in-depth analysis, it becomes clear that this case reshaped national conversations about accountability and transparency in profound ways. It challenged prosecutors, lawmakers, and citizens alike to reflect on how legal authority should be exercised and monitored. The controversy demonstrated that even a single document, negotiated quietly and signed without widespread attention, can ignite debate that spans more than a decade. The responsibility now rests with institutions and communities to ensure that lessons learned translate into meaningful safeguards for future. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.